Have you ever had one simple moment completely change the way you look at the soil beneath your feet? For me, that moment happened in the middle of someone else's field, on a small family farm near Holmes County, Ohio, deep in Amish country. It was early spring, and I was watching an older farmer walk slowly through his garden with the calm confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime learning from the land. What caught my attention first was the soil. It was dark, almost black, with a rich, crumbly texture that every gardener dreams of. It looked as if it had been carefully prepared by hand for years, layer by layer, season after season. But then I noticed something that truly stopped me. There was not a single fresh tool mark in that soil. No deep furrows, no overturned clods, no rough cuts from a mechanical tiller. Nothing suggested that machine blades had recently torn through the ground. Through a neighbor who knew the family, I asked him when he had last tilled that field. He looked at me with a gentle smile, almost as if I had asked the most unusual question in the world, and said, "We don't do that here." That one sentence stayed with me. It sent me down a path I have been exploring ever since, and it changed the way I think about gardening, soil, and food production. Welcome back to Earthly Delights, my friends. Today, we are not just talking about growing vegetables. We are talking about unlearning some of the habits many of us copied without ever questioning them. And we are going to focus on one of the most loved crops of summer, sweet corn. Maybe you have planted corn exactly the way the seed packet told you to. You spaced it carefully, watered it faithfully, waited all season with excitement, and then at harvest time you peeled back the husk only to find an ear with missing kernels, empty gaps, and disappointing results. Naturally, you might blame the soil, the weather, your watering, or even your timing. But what if the real problem was not you at all? What if the problem was the neat straight rows you planted your corn in? Today, we are going to look at why many Amish growers avoid planting corn in long, narrow rows, how their block-style method can dramatically increase yields in a much smaller space, and what this approach teaches us about working with nature instead of constantly working against it. So let's get our hands into the soil and begin. Part 1, the pollination problem. The flaw of the row. To understand the Amish approach, we first need to understand why so many of us plant corn in long, narrow rows. And the honest answer is simple. That layout was never created because corn plants needed it. It was created for machines. The straight row system that has appeared in gardening books and farming guides for generations was designed around tractors, mechanical cultivation, and large-scale commercial production. A tractor can move easily between straight rows. A cultivator can clear weeds without damaging the crop. A mechanical harvester can work more efficiently when every plant stands in a predictable line. So over time, the spacing, the row width, and even the way we think corn should be planted were shaped more by machinery than by the biology of the plant itself. And when a backyard gardener copies that same system into a small home garden, something strange happens. We end up planting as if a tractor is going to drive through our little patch, even though that tractor is never coming. Corn does not care whether your garden looks neat from a distance. What corn truly depends on is pollen. Unlike many garden crops that rely heavily on bees and other insects, corn is mostly pollinated by wind. At the top of each stalk is the tassel, the male part of the plant, releasing millions of tiny grains of pollen into the air. That pollen must fall or drift down onto the silks that emerge from the ears lower on the stalk. Every single strand of silk is connected to one potential kernel. If that silk receives pollen, a kernel forms. If it does not, that spot stays empty. So when you peel back an ear of corn and see missing kernels, you are looking at a record of missed pollination. Now think about a single long row of corn. When the tassels release pollen, the breeze carries it wherever it wants. If the wind blows across the row, much of that pollen simply travels past the plants and lands on bare soil. In a thin row, a large share of the silks may never receive pollen at all, which is why so many home gardeners end up with half-filled ears and disappointing harvests. The problem is not always poor soil, bad seed, or careless watering. Very often, the layout itself has quietly weakened the harvest, and that raises an important question. Why are we still following a system built for machines when we are trying to grow living plants? Part 2, the block planting solution. The geometry of success. Amish farmers in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and parts of Wisconsin recognized this problem long ago. For generations, they have grown corn in a way that works with the plant's natural pollination pattern, instead of forcing it into a machine-friendly design. Rather than planting long single rows or thin double rows with wide empty spaces between them, they grow corn in dense blocks. These are tight, rectangular or square plantings with the corn arranged in a grid. A good block should be at least 4 rows deep and 4 rows wide. From the outside, it looks less like a line of separate plants and more like a strong green wall. And that wall is exactly what makes the system work. When corn is planted in a block, pollen has a much better chance of landing where it needs to land. No matter which direction the breeze moves, there are other plants nearby to catch it. The plant downwind catches some pollen, the next one catches more, and the plants inside the block are surrounded by tassels from every side. This creates much better pollination. Instead of pollen drifting away into open space, it stays within the planting. More silks receive pollen, and the ears fill out more completely from base to tip. When pollination is strong, the plant may even support a second usable ear lower on the stalk, something that is much less common when corn is grown in thin, isolated rows. This is not about a secret seed variety or a costly fertilizer. It is simple geometry. The arrangement of the plants determines how much pollen reaches the silks. For this method to work well, there is a practical minimum, 4 by 4 or 16 plants in a tight grid. Anything smaller is usually too weak to create the same pollination effect. A 5 by 5 or 6 by 6 block is even better because it creates a stronger, more reliable pocket of pollen within the planting. Once you understand that, you start to see corn differently. It is not asking to stand alone in a perfect line. It grows better when it is surrounded, supported, and connected. Part 3, the secret of spacing. Embracing the crowd. Now let's talk about spacing, because this is where many gardeners hesitate. If you read a standard seed packet, it may tell you to place corn plants 12 to 15 inches apart in the row, with 30 to 36 inches between rows. That sounds official, but once again, much of that spacing was designed to leave room for equipment to pass through. In a home garden, those wide gaps between rows are often wasted space. They spread the plants too far apart, weaken the block effect, and reduce the dense cloud of pollen that corn needs for strong ear development. The Amish-style approach is much tighter. Instead of wide aisles, the plants are spaced about 8 to 12 inches apart in every direction. That means the distance between plants is similar whether you measure across the row or between rows. A 4 by 4 block of 16 corn plants at about 10-inch spacing can fit into an area roughly 40 inches by 40 inches, just a little over 3 feet by 3 feet. In other words, a very productive corn patch can fit inside a single raised bed. To a modern gardener, this may look crowded at first, but corn can handle closeness when the soil is prepared properly. In a tight group, the plants grow upward together, shelter one another from wind, and create a cooler, more protected space at the soil surface. The leaves shade the ground, helping hold moisture, reduce heat stress around the roots, and slow down weed growth. But there is one important trade-off. Closer spacing means more competition for food. Corn is a heavy feeder, especially when it comes to nitrogen. If you want dense planting to succeed, the soil cannot be weak or hungry. Before planting, work 2 to 3 inches of finished compost into the top 6 inches of the bed. That compost becomes the foundation of the whole system. It improves soil structure, feeds the microbes, holds moisture, and provides a steady release of nutrients as the corn grows. When you plant corn this closely, you cannot just feed the plant once and hope for the best. You need to feed the soil first. Do that well, and the soil will support the crowd. Part 4, the art of hilling, supporting the giant. There is one important step in this block planting method that many modern gardeners overlook, even though it can prevent one of the most common failures in growing corn at home: hilling. As a corn stalk grows taller, it begins to develop a set of strong aerial roots near the base of the plant. These are called brace roots. They appear from the lower nodes of the stalk, just above the soil line, and begin reaching downward toward the ground. Their job is simple but extremely important. They help anchor the plant. If you have ever seen corn knocked flat after a summer storm, you already understand why this matters. A corn plant can grow tall and heavy very quickly. In wide open spacing, a single stalk is more exposed to wind, and when a strong thunderstorm rolls through, the plant can tip over from the base. Gardeners often call this wind throw, and it can ruin a crop almost overnight. Hilling is a simple practice, but it makes a big difference. When the corn reaches about knee height, usually around 12 to 18 inches tall, pull 2 to 3 inches of soil up around the base of each stalk. This does two important things. First, it covers those young brace roots and puts them in direct contact with moist soil so they can grow down and grip the ground more firmly. Second, it gives the base of the stalk physical support, helping it resist side pressure from wind. That small mound of soil also helps improve drainage around the root collar during heavy rains, reducing the risk of the base sitting in water for too long. Amish growers often hill their corn just once. They use a simple hoe to pull soil from the path areas toward the stalks. For a backyard block, the whole job can take only a few minutes, but the protection it gives the crop is enormous. Skip this step and one strong July storm may flatten your corn before harvest. Do it at the right time, and those stalks can stand tall and steady through weather that would otherwise break them down. Sometimes, in the garden and in life, a little support at the base is what allows something tall and promising to survive the storm. Part 5. Single variety synchronization timing is everything. Even if your corn block is perfectly shaped and your soil is rich, there is still one timing issue you cannot ignore. Corn pollination happens within a short biological window, and if that timing is off, the harvest can suffer badly. Each tassel releases pollen for only about 5 to 10 days. At the same time, each silk is receptive for roughly that same short period. For full ears, the pollen and the silks must be ready at the same time. If some plants shed pollen before the silks on other plants have emerged, much of that pollen is wasted. The result is a pollination mismatch, and that mismatch shows up later as missing kernels. The best solution is very simple. Plant one variety per block, not two varieties mixed together. Not three, just one. When the same variety is planted on the same day, the plants usually tassel within a tight window, often within just a few days of each other. The silks also emerge at nearly the same time. That overlap is what keeps pollination strong and gives each ear the best chance to fill completely. If you want to grow more than one type of corn, such as an old heirloom sweet corn and a colorful flint corn, plant them in separate blocks. Keep those blocks well apart, at least 50 feet when possible, and sometimes more depending on the type of corn. This helps reduce cross-pollination. That matters because corn quality can change when varieties cross. If a super sweet corn crosses with a standard field corn, the kernels may become starchy, tough, and disappointing instead of tender and sweet. For extra assurance, you can help the process during the key pollination window. When the silks are pale, fresh, and slightly sticky, walk through the corn early in the morning. Gently shake the tassels by hand. You will often see a light cloud of pollen fall downward onto the silks below. It takes only a few minutes, but it can make a real difference, especially in a small garden where every ear matters. The wind does most of the work, but a gardener who understands timing can give nature just enough help to finish the job well. Part 6. The Three Sisters Enhancement, the Ancient Polyculture. Now we can take this block planting method one step further by learning from an even older tradition. Long before Amish farming practices became known in North America, indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Cherokee, developed a powerful plant partnership known as the Three Sisters. This method brings corn, pole beans, and winter squash together in the same growing space. It is one of the clearest examples of plants supporting one another in a practical, productive system. The corn grows tall and strong, providing a living trellis for the beans. The beans climb upward instead of spreading across the ground, using the corn stalks for support. At the same time, beans are legumes, which means they can work with soil bacteria to help fix nitrogen from the air into the soil. That nitrogen supports the fertility of the bed and benefits the heavy-feeding corn and squash. Then comes the squash. Winter squash spreads across the ground with broad leaves that act like a living mulch. Those leaves shade the soil, slow down weed growth, hold in moisture, and help keep the root zone cooler during the hottest part of summer. In a well-balanced planting, each crop has a role, and none of them are there by accident. The timing is important. Start with the corn block first. Let the corn grow until it is about 6 inches tall and has a firm enough root system to hold itself. Then plant pole bean seeds near the base of every second or third corn stalk. Do not rush this step. If the beans climb before the corn stalks are strong enough, the weight of the vines can bend or even break the young corn. About 2 weeks after planting the beans, add winter squash seeds around the corners and outer edges of the block. This gives the squash space to spread without overwhelming the young corn and beans too early. With this method, you are not just planting crops side by side. You are building a small working ecosystem. In one block about the size of a dining table, you can harvest sweet corn, dried beans, and heavy winter squash from the same footprint. That is where the real increase in production comes from. It is not only more corn, it is more total food from the same space, because every plant is doing a job that supports the others. And that is one of the finest lessons a garden can teach us. When the right companions grow together, abundance becomes easier for everyone. Part 7. The no-till philosophy, protecting the soil metropolis. Now let's step back from the corn itself and look at the foundation that makes all of this possible, the soil. Remember that Amish farmer with the dark, crumbly earth who told me we don't do that here when I asked about tilling. That answer was not just a habit, it was a whole philosophy, and it is one of the reasons their gardens can be so productive year after year. For many decades, gardeners were taught that spring preparation meant turning the soil, breaking it apart, and working it aggressively before planting. But the more you understand soil, the more you realize it's not just dirt. Healthy soil is a living city beneath your feet, filled with fungi, bacteria, worms, insects, air spaces, roots, and organic matter all working together. One of the most important parts of that underground world is the mycorrhizal fungal network. These microscopic fungal threads connect with plant roots and help them reach water and minerals the roots could never find on their own. In return, the plants feed those fungi with sugars created through photosynthesis. It is a quiet exchange, but it is one of the most powerful systems in nature. When a mechanical tiller cuts through a garden bed, it does more than loosen soil. It tears through those fungal connections like an earthquake passing through a city. It also destroys the tunnels made by earthworms, the very tunnels that help rain move down into the soil and allow oxygen to reach the root zone. And there is another problem. Tilling brings buried weed seeds up into the light, where they quickly germinate and create a new wave of weeds. Instead of disturbing the soil every season, Amish gardeners often rely on permanent beds. The growing areas stay in the same place, and the walking paths stay in the same place. By keeping feet, carts, and tools off the planting beds, they prevent one of the biggest causes of soil compaction. If they need to start a new bed over weeds or difficult clay, they do not always rush to dig it up. They use smothering. A thick layer of cardboard goes over the weeds, then compost is added on top, followed by a generous layer of straw. The cardboard blocks sunlight and weakens the weeds, while worms and soil organisms slowly pull the organic material down. After a few months, the bed begins to transform into rich, workable soil with far less disturbance. Part 8. Contiguous feeding and living roots. The endless cycle. Now you might wonder, if we are not tilling compost and fertilizer deep into the ground, how does the soil get fed? The answer is simple. Feed from the top, the way nature does. A forest never tills itself. Leaves fall to the surface, break down slowly, and are carried into the soil by insects, worms, fungi, and microbes. Nutrients move downward over time. The soil life does the mixing. That same idea works beautifully in a garden. Amish growers often top-dress their permanent beds with 1 to 2 inches of finished compost or aged manure in spring and again in fall. This steady feeding builds fertility without tearing apart the soil structure. But they do not stop there. They also protect the surface, because bare soil is vulnerable soil. When soil is left uncovered, it loses moisture quickly, heats up and cools down too sharply, and can wash away during heavy rain. A thick layer of organic mulch, usually 4 to 6 inches of straw, shredded leaves, or spoiled hay, acts like a protective blanket. It holds moisture, softens the impact of rain, keeps the soil cooler in summer, and reduces the need for constant watering. But one of the deepest lessons is the value of living roots. Amish gardeners rarely leave a bed empty for long. After the main harvest, they often plant a cover crop. Living roots release compounds called exudates, including sugars and proteins, that feed the soil microbes directly. When a bed is left bare for months, much of that underground life begins to starve. That is why crops like crimson clover or winter rye are so useful when planted 6 to 8 weeks before the first frost. Their roots keep feeding the soil community through the colder months. Then in early spring, the cover crop can be cut at the base and left on the surface as mulch. The roots decay in place, leaving small channels for air, water, and future roots. Every season, this approach adds something back. Instead of mining the soil until it becomes tired, you are making regular deposits into a living bank account beneath your garden. Conclusion. The Amish approach to growing food is not simply about rejecting modern tools or doing things the old way for the sake of tradition. At its heart, it is about understanding what the earth needs, giving it the right conditions, and then stepping back enough to let natural systems do their work. Tilling a garden every spring or planting corn in long, empty rows may look orderly and productive, but it often fights against the needs of both the plant and the soil. The row system that dominates modern corn growing was built for machines. A small garden is different. It is a living space, and it responds best when we treat it that way. When we stop forcing corn into thin, isolated lines planted in supportive blocks, bring in companion crops like beans and squash, protect the soil's surface, and preserve the living networks underground, the whole garden begins to change. You do not need a massive farm to grow a meaningful harvest. You can begin with a small block, a handful of seeds, rich compost, close spacing, and one good hilling at the right time. From a space no bigger than a small bathroom floor, you can grow corn that fills out better, stands stronger, and teaches you something important about working with nature instead of against it. So what will you plant in your garden next season? Are you ready to leave the rows behind and try the block method for yourself? If you are, drop the word grow in the comments below. It may help another gardener who has struggled with empty cobs for years finally realize that the solution was not an expensive product, but a better shape. Thank you for joining me here at Earthly Delights. If these practical, soil-friendly lessons helped you, make sure to subscribe so we can keep learning and growing together. Until next time, keep your hands in the dirt and keep noticing the quiet wonders happening beneath your feet.